inside the hollow key block of a 1903 upright piano, behind a dead moth and a pad of felt dust, I found the original notarized agreement my daughter swore had been lost in a basement flood 6 years earlier. That single piece of paper voided a $750,000 sale, put my son-in-law in federal custody, and ended with my daughter restringing pianos in a smock that says struck a false note, while every tuning certificate from my shop prints her fraud docket number. I am 59 years old, and I spent 29 years pushing a mop through an elementary school, fixing what other people broke, and never once losing a master key. This is the story of how a school custodian learned to read a forged dissolution like a prosecutor, and how a dead man's warning from my late husband saved my life. My name is Ruth Harmon. I spent 29 years as an elementary school custodian at Lincoln Elementary, where I learned that the most dangerous problems are the ones you cannot see, the ones behind the drywall inside the lock under the floor wax. I took $126,000 out of my pension, every cent of it, to open a piano restoration and tuning studio with my daughter Caitlin. We notarized a 45% stake for her, and I promised my church a lifetime of free tunings because they let me practice on their old Steinway M when I was first learning the trade in the church basement. My late husband, Hal, had been the quiet architect behind every paper I ever signed. He rebuilt that 1903 upright before he died, and he taught me that the most important documents in a person's life should live where no one would ever think to look. Caitlin was the people person. Her husband Marcus was the numbers person. Their job was to smile at the clients and talk about cash flow. Mine was to keep the instruments alive, even when the soundboards were cracked and the pin blocks were shot. In that storefront on Mill Street, I rebuilt 5 Steinways from the ground up, a Model B that had belonged to a retired opera singer named Mrs. Ellerman, a Model O that had survived a basement flood in a house on Sycamore, a Model M that had sat in a church basement for 40 years with mouse nests in the action, and 2 Model A's that came from an estate sale with cracked soundboards and rusted strings. I did the work myself day after day with a tuning lever, a set of voicing needles, and a steam generator for straightening warped keys. I kept every receipt, every sharp drawing, every pin block template in a hanging file inside the back room. The original partnership agreement was not in that file. Caitlin had told me it was lost in a basement flood when she cleaned out old files. I believed her because she was my daughter. That was my first mistake. The trouble started on a Tuesday in late October when a music school chain called Chilton Music Conservatories offered $750,000 for our restored Steinway inventory and the exclusive service contracts. I still remember the exact number because I wrote it in pencil on the back of a church bulletin from the previous Sunday. $750,000 for 5 pianos and the right to say they were serviced by our shop. I said no immediately. Those pianos were not inventory to me. They were the B that had belonged to a retired opera singer named Mrs. Ellerman, the O that had survived a basement flood in a house on Sycamore, the M that had sat in a church basement for 40 years, and the 2 A's that I had rebuilt from cracked soundboards and mouse nests. I had replaced their pin blocks, restrung their harps, and voiced their hammers until the tone came back from the dead. Caitlin and Marcus said I was being sentimental and old. They said a real businesswoman takes the money and retires. I told them the shop was not for sale, and that the service contracts belonged to the church and to our private clients, not to Chilton. 2 weeks later, I walked into the showroom on a Monday morning and found the floor half empty. The Steinway B was gone. The Model O was gone. The 2 rebuilt A's were gone. The Model M was gone too, even though the church had a maintenance claim on it. The only sound in the room was a fluorescent light buzzing over the front desk. Caitlin stood by that desk with a cashier's check for $4,300 in her hand. It was drawn on a bank I did not recognize, with a routing number from Delaware. She called it a damper settlement. She said the sale was final, the papers were signed, and I should be grateful for the payout. I asked to see the dissolution agreement. She said it was in the cloud, whatever that means, and that I had signed it 2 weeks earlier when I was too stressed to remember. I told her I had signed nothing. She rolled her eyes and said the buyer had already taken possession and that the money was in escrow. Marcus came out of the back room with a moving dolly and a roll of stretch wrap. He said I should go home and rest, that the paperwork would make sense when I was less emotional. The only instrument they left behind was the 1903 upright, the one Hal had rebuilt, the one with the cracked ivory on middle C. It stood in the corner near the front window, covered in dust sheets. Caitlin pointed at it and said, "Take that firewood with you if you want. We already scheduled the trash pickup for Thursday. Marcus laughed and said it would cost more to move than to burn. Then he pushed it toward the back service door with his foot, and the caster left a long scar in the floorboards. I watched from the front window and waited until dark. I did not argue, because arguing with a forged dissolution and an empty showroom would have got me nothing. When the streetlights came on, I pulled on my work gloves, took the hand truck from the back closet, and used the same nylon strap I had used to move library carts for 29 years to pull that upright back inside. It took me 40 minutes. The casters were old, the strap bit into my shoulder, and the cracked ivory on middle C caught the parking lot light like a missing tooth. That night, I did what I always did when I was sad or angry or both. I removed the fallboard, lifted out the key slip, and reached into the hollow key block to check for loose screws and old felt dust. The key block is the wooden block at the left end of the keyboard that holds the keys in place. It is hollow in old uprights, a cavity no one ever opens unless they are repinning the keyboard. My fingers hit something that did not feel like wood. Inside that hollow key block, under a layer of dust, a dead moth and a rusted paper clip, was a heavy manila envelope sealed with clear packing tape. I lifted it out carefully because the paper felt soft and old. The envelope was stamped with the logo of the county title office. I opened it with a utility knife from my tool bag. Inside was the original notarized agreement, the one from the very beginning, the one Caitlin had claimed was destroyed in a basement flood when she was cleaning out old files 6 years earlier. It was not destroyed. It was hidden. The notary stamp was intact. Both signatures were there. The date was legible. And on the last page in my late husband Hal's handwriting were 3 sentences. Do not trust them. The key block was my idea. Save yourself. I sat on the floor of my empty showroom and pressed that paper to my chest like a living will. The dead moth left a smudge on my sleeve, and I remember thinking that Hal had known, maybe for years, and had built a trap I did not yet understand. I read the 3 sentences again. I knew Hal's handwriting from 40 years of birthday cards and grocery lists. The way he crossed his T's with a long tail, the way he wrote the number 7 with a line through it. He had written this not as a warning from the grave, but as an instruction from a man who had already seen the shape of the trap. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a mother's sacrifice should never become a child's business plan. Within 3 days of the sale, Caitlin and Marcus started circling me like vultures. I was staying at my small house near the church, trying to eat and sleep and not think about the empty showroom. Caitlin called 5 times a day with sweet concern. Marcus drove over with a leather folder titled Estate and Care Planning. He wore a pressed button-down and carried 2 expensive pens in his shirt pocket. They said I was foggy, forgetful, not safe alone after the emotional shock. They said the stress of losing the shop had made me confused, and that I needed help making decisions. They wanted me to sign a durable power of attorney and a quitclaim deed on my house, just to protect me in case something happened. They also had a medical proxy form and a release to transfer my pension account into a joint management trust. I played the part. I let my hands shake. I asked for water twice. I said I needed to pray about it and talk to my pastor. I never signed anything, not 1 page, but I did not tell them why. Instead, I acted weaker than I was. I let them help me pack a suitcase. Within a week, I was living in their guest room, which had a keypad lock on the outside of the door and a small camera mounted above the window. They said it was for my safety. I knew it was a control tactic, and I knew I needed to stay quiet and watch. The first time they brought the papers, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a frozen dinner. Marcus opened the leather folder and spread out 5 documents: a durable power of attorney naming Caitlin as agent, a quitclaim deed for my house transferring title to both of them, a medical proxy giving Caitlin the right to make end-of-life decisions, a release form for my pension account authorizing a rollover into a joint trust, and a small stack of blank signature pages which they said were just for convenience. He used the word consolidated. Caitlin used the word protected. I used the word confused very deliberately. I asked them to read the first paragraph out loud slowly. I lost my place 3 times. I spilled a little tea on the table and apologized too much. I told them I needed to pray about it and talk to my pastor before I could sign anything. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he smiled and said, "Of course, Mom. Take your time." That was the moment I knew they needed my signature more than they needed my comfort. They tried a different approach the next day. Caitlin came over alone and told me she was worried I might say something to the wrong person. She said the church people would not understand business decisions, and that if I talked to Pastor Jim, He would probably call Adult Protective Services and then I would lose control of everything. She said the best thing was to stay with them for a few weeks, just to rest and recover. She helped me pack a bag. She took my car keys and said I did not need to drive anymore. She put my mail on forward to her address. Within a week, I was living in their guest room, which had a keypad lock on the outside of the door and a small camera mounted above the window. They said it was for my safety. I knew it was a control tactic, and I knew I needed to stay quiet and watch. The first night, I lay in the guest bed and tested the doorknob from the inside. It opened because the keypad only locked from the outside. I made a mental note of that. I was not a prisoner yet, but I was being watched, and I had to act like I did not notice. On the fourth day, Marcus brought a man named Gerald Voss, an elder law attorney with a thin smile and a briefcase that smelled like new leather. Gerald sat down and explained, in a voice like lukewarm milk, that a temporary guardianship would be in my best interest. He said I was showing signs of emotional dysregulation and that court would likely approve a conservator if my own daughter petitioned. He did not ask me a single question about my medical history. He just handed me a pen and pointed to a line. I told him I wanted to pray first. He looked at Marcus and said we should schedule a follow-up. That was the closest I came to breaking character. I wanted to tell him that I had rebuilt a piano soundboard by hand, that I could still calculate the tension on a string in my head, that I had unclogged a school sewage line at 3 a.m. without calling a plumber. But I kept my hands folded and my voice soft. I said, I will think about it, Brother Voss. He left a business card on the table. I later used the back of that card to write down the phone numbers Marcus dialed at night. On the 5th day, Marcus came into my room with a clipboard and a smile. He said he had scheduled an appointment with a geriatric psychiatrist for the following Tuesday, just to establish a baseline for my cognitive health. He said it was routine after an emotional shock. I knew what a baseline was. I had sat through enough IEP meetings as a custodian to know that a doctor's note could be weaponized. I told him I would think about it, and I let my hands tremble around the coffee mug. I did not tell him that I had already called the church office from a payphone and left a message for Pastor Jim to pray for me, just so there would be a witness outside the family. The first red flag came at 2 a.m. on my 3rd night in their house. I woke up to use the bathroom and heard Marcus in the hall, whispering into his phone. He said the words bridge loan, prepayment penalty and acceleration clause. I stood behind the guest room door with my ear against the seam and listened. He said no, the escrow hold is not my fault. The wet signature irregularity is a formality. We just need the old woman to sign the release. Then he said if she drags this out, the bridge rate resets at 18% on Friday. The next morning, I heard him tell Caitlin that Chilton had placed the sale proceeds in escrow pending a final release, and the release required a live signature from me because the original dissolution had a wet signature irregularity. I sat in the guest room with a cup of cold tea and wrote down every word in a small spiral notebook I kept inside the zippered cover of my Bible. The notebook had a cardboard cover and a pencil stub from the church pew. I wrote bridge loan, prepayment penalty, acceleration clause, wet signature irregularity, live signature. Then I underlined the words old woman and drew a small circle around them. They were bleeding cash waiting for me to cave. Caitlin ordered a $40,000 Suburban from a dealership across town. She returned it 3 days later when the down payment check bounced. Marcus bought a new kitchen island from a high-end design shop, $7,800, and then cancelled the delivery when a credit line froze. I heard them arguing about the bridge loan interest accruing daily. Marcus said the lender wanted a draw request signed by both borrowers. Caitlin said I would not sign anything until I saw the original agreement. Marcus said the original agreement was gone, destroyed in a flood, and I was too foggy to remember. They smiled at me over dinner and told me not to worry about money, that everything was under control. I nodded and ate their food and kept listening. The food was under-seasoned and overcooked, and I chewed it slowly to avoid speaking. The first time I saw their helplessness up close was a Thursday afternoon. I had been there 6 days. Caitlin was standing over the kitchen sink with a phone in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other. The disposal was jammed and the sink had backed up with grey water. Marcus kept asking his phone, Siri, how do I reset a garbage disposal? I walked in and Caitlin turned to me with that tight smile and said, we called a plumber, but he cannot come until Monday. Can you go back to your room? I looked at the sink. I saw a potato peel stuck in the drain flange and the water level rising. I said, let me see. I opened the cabinet under the sink, pulled out the basket wrench and a small hex key from the disposal toolkit that was still taped to the side of the unit. I turned off the disposal switch. I pressed the red thermal overload button on the bottom of the motor, which had tripped because the blades were jammed. Then I inserted the hex key into the small socket in the center of the bottom and turned it counterclockwise 3 times to free the impeller. I removed the potato peel with a pair of kitchen tongs, ran cold water and flipped the switch. The disposal roared to life and drained in 4 seconds. The whole repair took 6 minutes. Caitlin stared at me like I had performed open-heart surgery with a spoon. Marcus was still asking Siri whether the reset button was under the sink or behind the unit. That was the moment I stopped being afraid of them. They were not taking care of me. They needed me alive, compliant, and legally incapacitated so they could finish the theft. I was a retired custodian who could rebuild a pin block and unclog a drain. They could not reset a disposal without a podcast tutorial. 2 days later, the outlet in the guest bathroom stopped working. Caitlin told me not to touch it, that Marcus would call an electrician. Marcus spent an hour on a video chat with his brother, unscrewing the outlet cover and poking at it with a butter knife. I watched for a few minutes, then walked over, pressed the reset button on the GFCI outlet, and the lights came back on. Marcus looked at me like I had insulted his ancestors. I said the ground fault had tripped. It happens in older houses. Then I went back to my room and wrote down the word ground fault in my Bible notebook. After that, I started looking for physical evidence. One afternoon, I found the shredder in Marcus's home office jammed with strips of paper. The bin was overflowing, and the shredder had stopped halfway through a stack. I reached into the bin and pulled out a strip with the word dissolution and another with the number 4300. There were strips with the letters notary and release. I smoothed them out on the carpet and read what I could. The paper was from a standard printer, and the ink was black laser toner. I knew from years of fixing office equipment that shredded strips can sometimes be matched by the tear pattern if you have enough of them. I did not have time to reconstruct them, but I memorized the words and the density of the text. That evening I waited until they went to a wine tasting with the neighbors. Then I walked into the garage and found their filing cabinet locked behind a stack of moving boxes. I had learned to open a file cabinet without a key back in 1997, when the school principal locked his master key inside the supply closet, and I was the only person small enough to reach through the vent. I used 2 bobby pins from the guest bathroom and a tension wrench made from a paper clip I straightened and bent into an L. The cabinet was a basic fire-resistant model, not a high-security safe. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied light rotational pressure, the way you would turn a key. Then I raked the pins with the bobby pin, feeling for the shear line. The lock clicked in 40 seconds. Inside I found the forged dissolution. I found a fake witness signature that spelled Caitlin's name with an E on the end, not an A, Citline. I found a document naming me as guarantor on a $90,000 equipment loan for their home studio, a loan I had never signed, but which carried a confession of judgment clause. I found a Chilton purchase contract with a commission schedule that triggered only if I was declared incompetent. There was a Section 9 that released a $100,000 finder's fee to Marcus if the seller, meaning me, was adjudicated mentally incapable of handling business affairs. They were not just stealing my pianos. They were setting me up as the legal scapegoat for their debt, and they had been doing it for months. I started making copies with my phone. I did not use the camera flash because the light could reflect off the window and alert them. I used a small pen light from my purse, the kind mechanics carry, and I photographed every page, every signature, every loan term. I also found a small locked fire safe in the back of their bedroom closet, behind a shoe rack and a stack of old tax returns. That lock was easier. It was a 4-digit padlock, and Caitlin's birthday was 1204. Inside, there were bank statements from an offshore account in Nevis, a second set of books for Chilton, and a notary stamp that looked like the one from the forged dissolution, except the raised seal was missing 1 star. I took photos. I put everything back exactly where it was, using the dust patterns as a guide. I also noticed a second cell phone charging in Marcus's office behind the printer. It was not the phone he used in public. The screen protector had a crack shaped like a lightning bolt. I did not touch it, but I memorized the model and the lock screen photo, which was a picture of a beach. Later, when Marcus left it in the kitchen, I saw a text notification from a contact labeled Only C. The message said, "The old lady is still lucid. We need a different angle." I wrote that down in my Bible notebook. The next day, I told Caitlin I wanted to visit the public library to read the newspaper. She let me go because she thought it made me look normal. I used the library's computer to search the county recorder's office for any liens on my house. I found a document called a Notice of Lis Pendens filed against my property, signed by a lender called Meridian Capital Partners. I had never borrowed from them. The document claimed I had pledged my house as collateral for the equipment loan. I printed 2 copies and folded one into the lining of my coat. The other I mailed to Dana Whitfield's office with a note that said, "They are trying to take the roof over my head." Then I called a woman I knew from church, a forensic accountant named Dana Whitfield, who handled fraud cases for the County Bar Association. She had tuned pianos for fun and knew the difference between a forged signature and a real one. I called her from a prepaid phone I bought with cash at the gas station near the church, because my own phone was still being forwarded and I did not trust it. I asked her if she could meet me at the coffee shop on Mill Street, and I did not tell her why. She looked at my photos for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "Ruth, you are not the victim here. You are the tripwire." Dana Whitfield was not the kind of woman who jumped to conclusions. She was 55, wore her grey hair in a braid, and had spent 18 years as a bank compliance officer before she went private. She spread my photographs across the coffee shop table and lined them up like a deck of cards. The forged dissolution was first. She pointed to the notary stamp and said, "See this seal? It has a serial number. The state notary database records every stamp order by sequence. This stamp was issued to a notary named Beatrice Lunt, not to Edna Cole, and the sequence number is out of order by 200 entries, which means it was not used in a normal journal. A legitimate notary logs every notarization in a bound journal in chronological order. If the sequence jumps, somebody used a stamp they were not supposed to have." Then she pointed to the signature line. "The witness signature is spelled Caitlin. Your daughter's name is Caitlin with an A. That is not a typo. That is a person who has never seen the name on a birth certificate." She also found that the Chilton escrow had a condition precedent buried in the sale agreement. The sale could not close without a live verification from a specific notary log held at the church office. Hal had known exactly what he was doing. Dana pulled up a scanned copy of the original partnership agreement on her tablet. She showed me the 3rd page, the one I had not read in years. There was a 2-key provision, added by Hal before he died. Any transfer of the Steinway inventory or the studio assets required both partners to appear in person before the church notary, a woman named Edna Cole, and sign a bound ledger with wet ink and a fingerprint. The forged dissolution used a notary stamp from a different county. The church ledger had no entry for that date. The sale to Chilton was void ab initio from the beginning, and the escrow was frozen pending my live signature. Hal had built a dead man's switch into my own business papers before he died. The original agreement was the key, and it had been hiding in the Harlow key block of the 1903 upright, waiting for the moment I was ready. She also said, "Ruth, your late husband was not just a quiet architect. He was a man who understood that greedy people always overreach. He made sure that any transfer without both partners present would be legally nothing. He tied the assets to your physical presence, not just your signature. As long as you do not sign the release, they cannot touch the escrow. As long as you do not give them power of attorney, they cannot forge anything that sticks. The only way they can finish this is if you walk into that escrow office willingly and sign in front of a notary. And that is why they are keeping you in their house. They are not caring for you. They are staging you as incompetent so they can force a guardianship and sign for you." Dana paused and looked at me over her reading glasses. She said, "If you want to stop them, we need to wait until they take you to the bank. Then we need to make sure the authorities are in the room when they try." I asked her how we could do that. She said she had already spoken to a financial crimes agent named Lisa Chen at the regional FBI field office. Dana had forwarded my photos with my permission. Agent Chen said the offshore account in Nevis was linked to a shell company that Marcus had been using to hide commissions from Chilton. The equipment loan was fraudulent on its face because the lender had a forged guarantee, and the confession of judgment would be set aside once the forgery was proven. The FBI wanted a clean live take, not just documents. They wanted to catch Marcus and Caitlin in the act of forcing a signature. I said, "So I am the bait." Dana said, "No, Ruth, you are the fishhook." 2 days later, Dana arranged for me to meet Agent Chen in a parking garage on the east side. Agent Chen was a woman in her 40s with short hair and a voice like a filing cabinet drawer closing. She told me that the FBI had opened a file on Marcus 18 months earlier for structuring cash deposits, but they did not have enough for a warrant. My photos gave them probable cause. She said, "We will be in the room at Park Meridian Trust. Do not tell them, do not change your routine. When they push the pen toward you, that is our signal." I said, "How will you know?" She said, "Ruth Okada is one of ours. She has been an informant for 3 years. We will hear everything. I felt a cold wave go through me, not fear but relief. Somebody had been watching and I was not alone. The next morning I took a walk to the church. I told Caitlin I needed to sit in the sanctuary. Edna Cole was in the rectory office and she let me look at the notary ledger. She was 71 years old and had a memory like a steel trap. She flipped to the date on the forged dissolution and held up the page. It was blank. She said, "Ruth, I would remember if you and Caitlin had come in to sign a dissolution. I would have made you both put your thumbprints in the margin. There is no entry. That document is a lie." She put her hand on mine and said, "Your Hal called me 2 months before he passed. He said, Edna, if anything happens to Ruth's studio, you hold that ledger and you do not let go." I promised him I would, and I have. I did not confront Caitlin and Marcus right away. I needed one more thing. I needed to know if there was any part of them left that saw me as a person and not a legal obstacle. So I staged a medical scare. It was a Wednesday morning. I had planned it for 2 days, mentally rehearsing the fall so I would not break a hip. I wore non-slip socks with rubber grips on the soles. I stood up from the kitchen table, dropped my coffee cup and fell to the floor. I made my eyes roll back. I let out a gurgling exhale, the kind of sound I had only heard once before in my life, when an old man collapsed at the back of the church sanctuary. I lay still. My left arm was twisted under me, but I kept it there. The coffee spread across the tile in a brown arc. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Nobody moved. Caitlin looked down at me. Her face was not worried. It was annoyed. She said, not now, and picked up her phone to text the escrow officer. Marcus stepped over my body to grab the care agreement folder from the counter. He knelt on the floor next to my head, not to check my pulse but to open the folder and ask, did she sign the second page? I heard him flip through pages. Caitlin said, no, she has not signed anything. Marcus said, well, if she dies now, the whole deal is dead too. Then he stepped back over me and walked into the living room. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Nobody called 911. Nobody checked my breathing. I lay on the cold tile and listened to Marcus ask if I had an advance directive on file at the hospital. He was not trying to save me. He was trying to figure out whether my death would help or hurt the closing. That was the moment my daughter died to me. I had no family left except the woman staring back from the bathroom mirror. I lay there for 5 more minutes until the coffee cooled against my cheek. Then I stood up, washed my face in the guest bathroom and called Dana Whitfield on the prepaid phone. I said, I'm ready. When I walked into the living room, Caitlin was on the phone with a lender. She looked up and said, oh, you're fine. I said I slipped. She did not ask if I was hurt. Marcus was still holding the care agreement folder. He closed it and said, we should get you to sign the release now while you're still lucid. That word lucid told me everything. I nodded and said, soon, I need to rest first. Then I went back to the guest room, closed the door and sat on the bed. My hands were not shaking, they were steady. That was the moment I knew I could do what came next. 2 days after my staged collapse, Marcus and Caitlin were cornered. Chilton had sent a default notice by courier. The bridge loan was due at close of business Friday. The equipment loan had a balloon payment that would trigger the confession of judgment on Monday. They needed me to sign a release before a notary at Park Meridian Trust, the escrow agent downtown. They told me it was a small formality for my own peace of mind. Marcus said he had already called ahead and made an appointment. Caitlin helped me into my coat, the same old wool coat that had belonged to Hal, the one with the hidden pocket inside the lining, where I kept the original agreement, folded flat against my hip. I carried my tuner's bag, the worn leather bag with brass fittings and a hidden compartment under the bottom tray, where I kept a photocopy of the notary ledger page and the forged dissolution. I let them drive. I sat in the back seat of their leased sedan and watched the city go by. Marcus drove too fast and tapped his fingers on the wheel. Caitlin kept looking at her phone and whispering with Marcus about whether the escrow officer would ask for my ID. I said nothing. I just breathed. The conference room at Park Meridian Trust had a long oak table and a window that looked out over the river. Ruth Okada, the escrow officer, sat at one end with a stack of papers. She was a small woman in a grey suit with a notary seal and a black ink pad in front of her. Marcus pulled out a chair for me. Caitlin sat to my left. The Chilton representative, a man in a navy blazer, sat at the far end with a tablet. The release papers were spread across the table like a poker hand. There was a signature page with a yellow tab that said seller release. There was a second page that said estoppel certificate. There was a third page that authorized the escrow agent to disburse the funds. I read the first paragraph slowly. It said that I, Ruth Harmon, as the managing partner of Harmon Piano Restoration, Did hereby release all claims against Chilton Music Conservatories and acknowledge receipt of $4,300 as full and final settlement of my interest. Marcus handed me a pen. It was a heavy silver pen with his initials. Caitlin smiled and said, "Just sign the last page, Mom." I took the pen and set it down on the table. I looked at Caitlin, then at Marcus, then at the Chilton representative. I said, "You sold my life's work for $4,300. I am not signing your lie. The only thing I will sign is the complaint that puts you where you put my pianos." Gone. Then the door opened. Ruth Okada stood up and nodded to a man in the hallway. 2 FBI agents from the Financial Crimes Task Force walked in, a woman named Agent Lisa Chen and a man named Agent Paul Ruiz. Agent Chen said, "Marcus Whitfield, Caitlin Harmon, you are under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder exploitation." Marcus stood up so fast he knocked his chair over. Caitlin's face went white. Agent Ruiz read them their rights. Edna Cole, the church notary, walked in behind them with her bound ledger. She was wearing her Sunday coat and holding the ledger with both hands. She flipped to the date of